inclusive growth, inclusive growth, ये शब्द पहले क्यों नहीं था?
I think the budget is very reflective of inclusive growth.
Focus on how Africa can leverage human capital development for inclusive growth.
Can we make growth inclusive? Yes, says the OECD.
You just saw politicians, policymakers, journalists, and even documentary makers put their emphasis on inclusive growth, and rightly so. Decades of uneven economic growth has thrown up a lot of paradoxes. In our society, we have high affluence and rich living, but it is also accompanied with poverty, deprivation, and poor standard of living. This is a brief idea about the content of this video. First, we will see how inclusive growth is the focus area of not just the government, but also multilateral institutions and also the private sectors. Second, we will try to find out whether inclusion includes each and every one of the society or only the most vulnerable section of the society. Third, we will try to find out the exact target of inclusive growth in terms of percentage of population. Fourth, we will try to find out whether mere employment or better employment is the necessary criteria for inclusive growth. Fifth, we will try to find out whether there exist any non-economic dimensions of inclusive growth. Here we can see that report on inclusive growth being published by government bodies like Niti Aayog and RBI. Similarly, we can see report on inclusive growth published by several big private players, despite the popular perception that private players are more concerned about profit and less concerned about how this wealth is being distributed in the rest of the society. In fact, every year we have several reports published by international bodies which highlight the existing inequality and also the inadequacy of the existing growth model in taking everyone along. Growth can include agricultural production, better infrastructure, logistics, more construction, manufacturing, employment, and wealth creation. This is one of the most common definitions of inclusive growth. Here we can see that it talks about including everyone from middle class to poor and even the rich.
सबका साथ सबका विकास, सबको जोड़ करके चलने से कैसे परिणाम आते हैं, हमने करके दिखाया.
Let us refine this definition of inclusion a bit more. Does inclusion really mean that it will include everyone, or will the focus be more on some selected target groups which are more vulnerable and hence are at a threat of being left out? Let's look at how the word inclusion is being used in daily life. Here we look at an article on Jan Dhan Yojana. Jan Dhan Yojana was widely appreciated for bringing about financial inclusion. But essentially, it was about bringing the unbanked section of the population, that is those without bank accounts, into the formal banking system. So it was obvious that the scheme of financial inclusion, this Jan Dhan Yojana, did not target everyone, and definitely did not target those who were dealing in foreign currencies, bitcoins, and forex reserves. Now we focus on the second article. It is from PIB. If you look into the content of the article, whose heading I have given here, you will find that these initiatives are targeted towards a particular section, which includes rural entrepreneurs, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and beneficiaries of the Mudra Yojana. So again, we can see that the word inclusion here, it is focused on some predetermined sections of the society which are more vulnerable, and hence special provisions are being made so that they can be integrated into the mainstream. Here we can see two articles. The first one talks about political inclusion of migrants. Now the term inclusion will never be applicable for the natives of a region because they are already well integrated into the ecosystem of the cities or whatever region. Political inclusion will always be used for migrants who are vulnerable and hence are at the maximum threat of being excluded from the mainstream due to social, political, economic, and even cultural reasons. The second article talks about tribals of our countries. They again have their unique sets of challenges which prohibit their integration into the national mainstream. So we have a policy of inclusion to bring them as closer as possible to the national mainstream. So from the discussions of all these news articles, we can say that though the definition usually used for inclusive growth of targeting everyone may not be exactly be wrong, but it would be more appropriate to say that inclusive growth is that which is focused on more on targeting the vulnerable sections of the society. Now, after being sure about the fact that inclusive growth is more about targeting the vulnerable sections of society rather than targeting everyone, the question arises as to how to identify this section, how to identify this beneficiary group. Should it be the last 10% or the last 20% of the population? Or should it be based on the per capita income of the population? Well, there are no fixed answers. This is a picture from Economic Survey of 2010-11. Here, you can see that for achieving the goal of inclusive growth, the target is to focus on the bottom 20% of the population. Now, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals 10.1, we can see that here the target is bottom 40% of the population. I'm sure you must be knowing about the Sustainable Development Goals, that is SDGs. Though we can say that SDGs is more about inequality and not exactly about the inclusive growth that this video is about. But it is also important to know that the fundamental target of inclusive growth is reducing inequality in growth process. So we can make an inference from it that another way of increasing the process of inclusion may be to target the bottom 40% of the population. Here I would like to mention that inference is a very important concept and tool in social sciences, because most of the times you may not have very clear cut answers and you have to come to a conclusion based on some broad indicators. The third refinement that we can do in our statement of inclusive growth is that instead of inclusive growth offering equal opportunity to everyone, in fact it should be offering equitable opportunity for all. This is because obviously a person from IIT cannot be having the same opportunity as the person who has graduated from ITI. So after three refinements to the most general definition of inclusive growth, we finally reach here. The first refinement is that it targets vulnerable sections and not everyone. Second refinement is that the target of this section can vary from 20% to 40%. Here I have taken 20 to 25% to find somewhere of a midway between what was suggested by Economic Survey and what was suggested by the Sustainable Development Groups. The third refinement is that it offers equitable opportunities and not equal opportunities to everyone. Let us learn more about the definition of inclusive growth. Consider an imaginary situation in which a person called Ramadhir Singh, who is an ultra-rich industrialist plus a gangster, he decides to invest in the mine-rich regions of Wasepur in Dhanbad, Jharkhand. His investments brings a lot of employment in Wasepur. This news of employment in Wasepur is heard by a person called Hathiram, who currently resides in Patallo. So he takes a Toto and arrives in Wasepur to get the job of a mining worker in Wasepur. So now the question arises that will you consider this aspect of Hathiram getting the job of a mine worker and earning from it an example of inclusive growth? Well, the answer is no. But why not? Growth is being created by Ramadhir Singh and Hathiram is a beneficiary of it. How come employment not means inclusive growth? Well, we can get some answers from this picture. This is an article from Asian Development Bank, and here you can see that one of the criteria for the growth to be called inclusive growth is that the target group should be having their growth of income to be equal to or more than the overall growth rate of the economy that is taking place in the country. Now, for the people who are working in the mining sector as daily wagers, even getting regular employment is a challenge. So expecting yearly revisions of their wages in accordance with the growth that is happening in the country is far-fetched. So we will not consider it Hathiram getting the job of a mine worker as example of inclusive growth, despite all the developments and all the employment that is being created. The same thing can also be inferred from this image of Sustainable Development Goals 10th target, which we have already discussed earlier. So, we can again infer from the discussion that mere participation in economic growth process is not enough to be called as inclusive growth. Benefits must be as high, if not more, than the overall economic growth of the country. And that's exactly the current problem that we are facing in the country. We often hear about the term called jobless growth. This is because after a certain age, a person will definitely look for at least some job to earn his livelihood, even if it means a PhD holder applying for the job of a clerk. So the issue is not, so the issue is less of the unemployment, and it is more of the issue of lack of better quality jobs. Let us refine the definition of inclusive growth a bit more. Say, for example, if poverty alleviation is happening, then can we say that it is also an example of inclusive growth? Well, the answer is no. But why not? If the dividends of growth in the form of taxation is being used by the government for targeting some particular section of the society, then it should come under the definition of inclusive growth. Well, though there is no black and white separation between inclusive growth happening and poverty alleviation being conducted, yet both are not exactly same. In the past 2 decades, India did exceedingly well in poverty alleviation, as we can see from these news reports. So, had inclusive growth been same as the issue of poverty alleviation, then we won't have been hearing recurring news of rising inequality in India. Yet we hear it all the time. So we can see that mere poverty alleviation in itself is not sufficient condition to be called as inclusive growth. Now let's ask another question. So if we ask that is redistribution of wealth same as inclusive growth? Right now in our country at state level and at central level, we have n number of schemes which are essentially some sort of redistribution schemes happening. So can we say that we are also undergoing a process of inclusive growth? Well, the answer is no. In this picture, we can see that Mr. Arvind Pangaria, he is criticizing any equation of mere redistribution as inclusive growth. He was the first vice chairman of Niti Aayog, and he is currently the chairman of 16th Finance Commission. This is an article of UNDP which emphasizes on the ineffectiveness of redistribution for achieving inclusive growth. We have another article of IMF. You can pause and read it, but here also the same thing is being said. So the conclusion is that for inclusive growth, mere getting employment or mere poverty alleviation or mere redistribution of wealth is not enough. For exact inclusive growth, we must have the focus on better employment. But who defines what is better employment? It is a very subjective concept. For at least some sort of clarity, we look at the picture of economic survey from 2010-11. Here we can see that productive employment with decent work condition is one of the criteria for inclusive growth. So finally, we come to the final definition and scope of the concept of inclusive growth. The first 2 points we have discussed in the video. The third point, that is labor intensive employment is necessary for inclusive growth, is obvious and self-explanatory. The fourth point we have not discussed, but it is also obvious because this is what is lacking in our country presently. We have more than half of the population employed in agriculture, but agriculture as a whole contributes to just around 15% of the GDP. Then we come to the fifth point. Fifth point is about scope of opportunities for all sections of society. Well, this video was deliberately focused on the economic aspects of inclusive growth and not the non-economic dimensions. There exist n number of parameters which play a role in improving the access to opportunities. For example, if you look at the geographical factors, there can be issues of northeast or some other areas of where drought is more common or areas which receives heavy rainfall. If you look at the physical features, there can be issues like of including LGBTs, people who are differently abled, gender issues, and race issues. Similarly, if you look at the development aspects, you find that there are issues in healthcare, education, and skill development. These are some of the few dimensions which play a role in creating opportunities for achieving inclusive growth. So, it is practically impossible to integrate all these aspects in just a single video. In fact, it's quite unfortunate that most of the videos on YouTube on inclusive growth, which are made by UPSC aspirants, they include all the dimensions which I have just mentioned. This makes the video very long and it loses its focus. As you can see here, there are 27 indicators under 6 broad headings which were made by the Planning Commission in its 11th 5-year plan. You can pause the video and read these individual dimensions and its subcomponents. So we have finally come to the end of the video. Here are some of the things that I would like to mention. The first is that all the pictures, all the slides that I have made are taken from authentic sources. If you are more interested in knowing more about them, you can go to the headlines which are there in the slides and read them for better clarity. Second is that this was the first video that I am making on my YouTube channel, and so there are several shortcomings like in issues like voice, editing, and so on. So I will try to improve it in the next ones. The third is that the next videos in this inequality series will be, first will be causes of inclusive growth. The second will be why inequality hurts all the members of society, including the rich. The third will be the solutions of uh, reducing inequalities. The fourth will be capitalism and inequality and its relation. The fifth will be the several questions of mains UPSC asked in the civil services examination. Till then, God bless and thanks for watching.